Let's start with China, because obviously that's top of mind. It's in the news a lot. And I know that we could spend the entire time talking about tariffs, but just in general, I think most people know that China's very big, economy's very big. They're a threat to the United States, but maybe not know the next levels beneath that. So could you talk a little bit about how you perceive China, how listeners should be thinking about it, and where you think it may be going in the coming years?
China is a very large, very complicated society with an ancient history and is very rapidly modernizing. On the positive side, they've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last decades. They are contributing remarkable discoveries and inventions in every major field of technology. And they have a deep and ancient culture. On the very negative side, in my view, a lot of that modernization was done at our expense by stealing American inventions and intellectual property. They are competing with us directly in terms of the values that will guide the world and world systems. I've been to dozens of countries where when I first visited 15 or 20 or 25 years ago, the Chinese presence was very minimal, and the United States was the partner of choice, either commercially or politically or for development purposes, and where the Chinese have largely supplanted the United States. So Nairobi, for example, is a city I first went to in 1984, and I've been to a dozen times, I think, since. You can't drive around Nairobi without seeing big signs of Chinese development projects, without seeing a demonstrable Chinese economic presence. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that the United States, which had enjoyed for decades being the predominant global partner, whether it was for Turkey or Indonesia, Brazil or Kenya, now faces very active peer competition from China for economic partnerships, for hearts and minds, and for security relationships. And so for those of us who care about democracy, free speech, open society, free media, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and their approach to governance and to individual rights is fundamentally different from ours. And they are actively telling societies and leaders through their information channels that the United States approach to individuals and human rights and the world and free societies is just flat out wrong, and that their development model is the better one. One of the striking things when you visit most countries around the world is there's 24-hour, very high quality Chinese programming on television, both in English and in whatever the local language is. The United States does not, as a government, invest anything like what the Chinese and the Russians do in propaganda and communications. In fact, President Trump just defunded Radio Free Asia, which for a modest cost was connecting to hundreds of millions of people all over the Indo-Pacific. So what do I see when I see China? A peer competitor that has a fundamentally different idea about how societies ought to be organized. Our economies are very closely intertwined. If you go to Costco or Walmart, if you go to most grocery stores or department stores, an awful lot of what you're buying is made in China or produced in China. And during the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union, which also had fundamentally different systems and ideas of government and were in a real competition, the Cold War, our economies were not connected at all. We had very little trade with the Soviet Union. It's fundamentally different today. There's a very large number of Chinese nationals who have been students at American universities for decades now, hundreds of thousands. There's very regular interchange, both trade and scientific and cultural. But the tension, the demonstrable, clear tension between our countries in terms of our competition over market share, mind share, and values has risen steadily in the 15 years that I've been in the Senate.
So President Trump seems to believe that blanket tariffs at a very high percentage is a solution to this. What's your response to that, both on the announcement of the delay of the reciprocal tariffs in general and then the 104% and the continued tariffs on China?
Look, three things. What I've heard from business leaders, small and large, for the 25 years I've been elected and for the near decade that I spent in the private sector with a global manufacturing company, was that predictability, whether in taxes or regulation, whether in the terms of business or in the role of government, predictability is absolutely critical, because being able to predict what the environment is when you're purchasing goods or entering contracts or building new facilities or relocating to new markets, predictability is king. President Trump has demonstrated the most unpredictable economic policy in just a few months of any president in my lifetime, arguably in history. Throwing on double-digit tariffs to our closest partners and allies, Canada and Mexico, our biggest trading partners, and then taking them off and putting them back on, then taking them off, and then slapping huge tariffs on dozens of countries all over the world, and then suspending them abruptly a few days later when the markets begin to tank, but keeping on steadily escalating tariffs against China, I think is a recipe for disaster in terms of our partnerships around the world. I think it's leaving American businesses, large and small, a bit at sea. Imagine you're running a small business and your principal inputs come from a country that, as of yesterday, was facing a 40% tariff rate. Now the president says he's going to suspend it for 90 days. What do? Hurry up and order huge quantities and hoard it before those tariffs come back? Guess that those tariffs will never come back? Explore moving your facilities or your contracts to another source? Get out of the market altogether? Liquidate now while you can? The level of unpredictability that Trump is injecting into our marketplace and our economy is unprecedented and destructive. First. Second, what country would want to enter a free trade agreement or some kind of market arrangement with the United States if the president can, on a whim, put on 10%, take off 10%, put on 50%, take off 50% tariffs? We are today at the highest level of tariffs we've been since the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that catapulted us into the Great Depression, if you look at U.S.-China. Now, our biggest trading partners are Canada, Mexico, and China, right? And he still has double-digit tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So the coordination between the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the Chinese over how to respond to our tariffs gave me a chill. That two countries that are treaty allies of ours, that we have been close partners with, that are democracies, Japan and Korea, are partnering with the PRC in terms of how to deal with us. That's a very, very bad development.